Awesome. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everybody, for having me. I'm Alex LoVerde. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Wymsee. We are an entertainment technology company and the creator of a production software service called Sync on Set. And Sync on Set is software specifically designed for the production design departments on TV and film. So we help manage everything from costumes to props to set decoration to all the locations and even makeup and hair. Last year, we served over 800 different production customers in over 50 countries. And if you look at the current mid-season TV schedule of what's airing right now in the US, roughly 50% of scripted series used our software. And today, I get the privilege of talking about simplifying data collection for content creators, which is near and dear to our hearts, which is essentially this idea of how do we get more data out of the content creation process so that we can use it way downstream. And so first, I'm going to talk about what kind of data it is that we can get out of production and what we're talking about today. Then I'll go into why it is that we want this data, what are some of the challenges today in simplifying data collection for content creators, and then how do we solve some of those challenges, and what does the future hold once we do. So this is just to start, kind of our company thesis, and just something that's important to keep in mind, which is the fact that when you think about creating content, you think about specifically the crews that work in production, they are focused not on your downstream metadata. They're focused on making their day, making their budget, making their schedule, and making a great picture, right? Making a great piece of artwork or whatever kind of project they're working on. And so one of the things that we picked up on was that if you want to simplify how to collect better data out of that, the best way to start is actually to simplify the content creation process itself. And so that's what we set out to do. And that's what we're going to talk about today is how do you create great tools that simplify content creation itself in order to collect better data and just make production better. So what data are we talking about? I can imagine you guys have gotten inundated with data talks already. I know that there's plenty more coming. So let's level set on what kind of data we're really talking about. There's all sorts of data that comes out of production, from title to factual to camera metadata and lighting and sound metadata. For our purposes in this talk, I'm going to specifically focus on descriptive metadata that relates to production design elements, because obviously that's our focus. But I hope that this is a useful analogy for what could be done with every other sort of set of data that you'd be interested in collecting. And then why do we care about it? In the production environment, there's a set of reasons, and then downstream, there's a set of reasons. So in production, the number one reason why we care about capturing some of this data is continuity. How many people here, just quickly by show of hands, are familiar with managing continuity? OK, so we generally have an idea of the concept. It's essentially this. If we're going to shoot a scripted TV series or a scripted feature film, we are not going to shoot it in story order, right? We're not going to shoot it in the order of the final cut of what we're going to see. What we're going to shoot is when locations are available and actors are available. And so for that reason, we're often coming back to scenes, coming back to sets, coming back to costumes and locations that we had previously shot. And we need to make sure that the living room is set up the same way, that the suit is worn the same way, with the buttons undone and with the shirt untucked, or whatever the details are. Those details are really critical to manage during production. Secondly, budgeting. Everything that's bought during production needs to be budgeted and then accounted for. So all the money that moves, data needs to be captured there during production. Asset management. So when we look at everything that is comprised of a studio pictures, costumes, and props, many of those things, whether they're bought or created, are probably assets of the studio. And so having details as to what is it, where is it from, what's its value, what's the disposition of it, has to be tracked during production and at the end. So that's something that they do. And then lastly, it's important to track this information for reshoots, right? If we're going to go back to a scene or go back to a character close-up or anything like that, matching continuity is then that much harder, because oftentimes when you're doing reshoots, your original crew is gone, right? This is a freelancer industry where people work on a project, and as soon as it wraps, they go on to their next project. So when we have to recreate for reshoots, there's a huge burden there of making sure that we have all the right records. And then why do we care downstream? For many reasons. So one is archives, right? Having a long-term archive of this information is really important to the studios, whether it's for sequels, for franchises, or just for historical purposes. Secondly, for marketing, right? Using specific photos of, let's say, set photos for publicity or costume fashion information for a social media campaign. Just some examples of how marketing is wanting to tap into some of this production content. Next generation viewing experiences, which I'll touch on again at the end, but essentially this idea of taking things like what we used to have as DVD extras or Blu-ray extras and bringing that to the digital retail environment so that we can make up for what's happening in home entertainment. How do we use things like interactive maps, which before would never have been possible? How do we bring that to a digital experience so we can look at all of the Google Earth views of where The Martian filmed? Or an interactive character closet. Take a show like Suits on NBC or on USA. How do we go through and make it possible to actually step through Harvey Specter's closet and learn about those characters' wardrobes? Those are some of the things that are coming in the future. And then that brings us to commerce. Just the idea of, this goes back to the 90s, of wanting to buy Jennifer Aniston's sweater on Friends. How do we make it possible to actually draw transactions out of your content? Well, it starts by knowing, what was that wardrobe? What were those props? What were those set pieces? Where did those things come from? And so tracking that data throughout production is really important downstream. And then lastly, I kind of throw out, and things we can't even predict today, but it's true, right? If we look back 10, 15 years, we couldn't have predicted the way we were going to watch content today. And if we look out the next 10, 15 years, the pictures we're producing today are going to be 20-year assets for our studios, right? And so looking out the next 20 years, we need to capture as much data as possible for whatever the future experiences could be, whether it's in a virtual reality, are we going to step into characters' closets? Are we going to have augmented reality while we watch TV and movies? And what kind of data is going to be important for that consumer consumption? So why is it so hard to get this data today? In order to answer this question, I'm going to walk through in some pretty good detail into certain steps of the workflow for a costume department on a scripted feature film. And I hope that this gives you guys a sense of not only the costume department, but how other production departments are working to track this information. I wish this was more of a history lesson, but this is actually still presently a common practice. We're, of course, trying to gain as much traction as we can, but this is still, more often than you think, a current standard in the industry as to the way this information is being tracked. It's paper-based. It's in disparate systems. It's completely and mostly analog. And therefore, it presents a very big challenge for how do we unlock that data downstream. So let's start at the very beginning. So it starts with a costume breakdown, which is we take a script, which is just scenes and characters, and there's a dog here. We take a script and we break down the scenes and characters, and we do that for two reasons. One is knowing how many scenes a character appears in, and not only the number of scenes, but how many story days those scenes span, gives the costume department an indication for budgeting reasons how many changes there are going to be, right? How many outfits are there going to be? They call those changes. And so we can map the number of changes. So they use that for budgeting, and then, of course, for the data structure, right? Having the change ID becomes a unique identifier for that outfit that then is traced throughout production. And the way the script breakdown is done today, you can see kind of a model of it as it used to be done, is literally annotating a script on paper and then typing into either Excel or a FileMaker-based system every scene, every character, in order to get a breakdown of how many changes are needed. Once we get into shooting, what's really important from an on-set standpoint is capturing the exact looks of every costume as they appeared. And this is where continuity comes in, right? Tracking the exact photos, multiple photos of how did it look in this angle, how did it look on that angle, so we can establish exactly what that outfit looked like. And then in addition to taking photos, either on a digital camera or maybe on an iPad or iPhone, they will handwrite or type out someplace else a detailed description of what went into that outfit. So detailed items of he's wearing a Bonobos blazer and he's got a J. Crew shirt, all that kind of information, as well as scene wear notes as to how exactly was it worn in that scene. Okay, the jacket came off in scene 5, but then when we get to 5A, he puts the jacket back on. And he puts it back on camera. So let's make sure we have that continuity when we come back to it. So this is what on set looks like. And then that information, the photos and the notes, will come back to either a costume trailer or a costume office if they're shooting on a lot. And someone, probably the costume supervisor in the office, will take the photos and they will print them out every one of them, and they'll tape them into a binder where they'll also annotate handwritten for that costume change what the scene-by-scene look was. So they'll copy down, again, what that itemized description was, as well as any where notes that are associated with it. And then looking at wrap, we obviously bring all those binders together, right? And all the binders come together, and all the paper goes back to the studio. And then all the physical inventory goes in a couple different directions. It'll either go back to a rental house if it was rented, which you can imagine is a very labor-intensive process to mark what's going to go back to a rental house, and are we going to need it again, and giving that annotation back to the rental house. If it goes back to the studio and is wrapped in their own archive, which you can see a picture here on the right of, they'll, of course, have to annotate, what is in that box, what scene was it from, what character was it from. But to get the full set of information, you'd actually have to go cross-reference the binder. So you can imagine searching and sorting and doing any kind of cross-production comparison is very hard here. And what kind of data do we get, right? So on this paper process, I say here summary of information captured. It's more summary of information that's created, right? This is the data that was created. We've got the title. We've got the script. We've got scene level data about characters. We've got scene level information about every item that's worn. And for each item, it was written down what the brand was, what the color was, a description of it. But unfortunately, the way in which this information was created and the way it's stored makes it very hard to use going forward. And just in case anyone was curious, every other production design department works pretty much the same way on paper, whether we're talking about the set decoration, the prop masters, the hairstylists, the makeup artists, even the location managers. Again, it's very much a disparate process of analog systems. So how do we simplify that? When we started our company, we initially had obviously seen this opportunity in the data, and we thought, wow, there's so much information. Wouldn't it be so cool in the future if all of this stuff was available to consumers and to brands and to studios and all of that? But yeah, how do you make it simple to collect that data? And when we talked to people who worked in production, and if you go, just talk to any crew member about this process, what we found was that the paper-based process really only existed because it was the best they had, right? No one's choosing that they want to do this. There just weren't great tools made for them. And when you actually dig in on those steps of that process, you find there's a lot of pain points. There's a lot of challenges in a paper-based system. And as is almost every other industry, there's still an analog pocket in production. But clearly there's an opportunity for software. And so this is actually our product, Sync on Set. And what we set out to do was create a great tool for the creative departments to digitize that workflow. So it's a web and mobile software application, cloud-based. When we started it, we started working directly with industry veterans to not only understand what is the workflow and how do we trace it digitally, but what are the pain points and how do we automate things, how do we make things easier? And so I'm going to go through those exact same phases of production and show you how we make it a bit easier. So starting with that script breakdown. So again, this used to be typed into Excel or a FileMaker-based system, and that would take 8 to 10 hours on a feature film, right? And then that's not only being done once, but every time you get a revision, you're spending more hours manually typing in information, every scene, every character. And then you look at the other departments, and they were doing the same thing. So one breakdown, it's done once, and it's actually automated. One of the things that we realized was not necessarily easy, but straightforward, was to write a program that can parse a PDF or an FDX file, which is a final draft file for anybody who's not that familiar with the production tools they use. But basically, every script is written in that format. It's pretty straightforward to write a program to parse out every scene and every character so that you could get a breakdown in seconds and create a budget in minutes. And not only does it do that, but then it creates a great data structure digitally that you can then use throughout production. So when we're on set, our mobile apps become really important, right? So we have mobile apps for iOS and Android. And these are used not only for the camera, but once they take all of their photos, they can quickly tag what scene that photo's for, what character appears in that photo, as well as the itemized description, right? What are every single item that appears in that photograph? And then it can actually enter that in. And instead of entering it in handwritten in a different format every time, we can standardize all that, right? So we get the brand, we get the retailer, we get the color, we get the size, we get the price. All that information can now be entered. And because it's a cloud-based system and it's called Sync on Set, all that information syncs, right? So it all comes together. So this concept of building the binder is no longer necessary. No one's spending copious amounts of money and time with a printer actually printing out photos and actually printing out all this information. It's all available in real time. And what's amazing is it's not only available to the folks within the costume department on that set, which is extremely helpful, but it's available to the other units, right? So for a Game of Thrones, for instance, which is one of our customers, being able to sync information across multiple units in real time is extremely helpful. And then not only is it multiple units and within costumes, but it's every other department, right? So if you need to share information between your art department and your costume department and your prop department, all of that is now possible. And then, of course, when we get to wrap, because we have a digital inventory of every item we use and every scene it appears in, it becomes very easy to go through and say, OK, this scene and this character are going to get wrapped in this box, and then this box is going to go back, or this outfit is going to go back to this rental house. And because all that information is actually tagged throughout, it becomes really easy to actually automate a lot of that, which is really exciting for wrap. And so what can you do with all this? Well, what's amazing is like this is what it looks like, right? Because now it's an API. The data is there. So what can you do with it? It's accessible for all of those use cases we talked about. So archives can now search and sort all of their archived information across their studio, across all their productions, right? They can really look into all of them in real time. For marketing, access to creating a shoppable character closet experience is now as easy as plugging an API into your website or into your mobile app, which can not only drive social engagement and just a deeper experience, but also can drive real dollars, right? Transactions and ads around that. And then lastly, this is actually something that we're a rough mock-up of some of the stuff that we're working on with partners, but it's essentially creating those next generation viewing experiences so that we can future-proof our content. Because again, these are 20-year assets. We really don't know what we're going to be viewing in the future and how we're going to be viewing it. And then lastly, I just want to say, so we've had a lot of great success doing this, working as a vendor, but it takes more than just innovative vendors creating great software. It takes innovative content creators, right? Because the whole concept here is it's not just about simplifying data collection for these guys. It's about simplifying content creation. And so it takes innovative studios who are willing to invest in new technology, and it takes innovative crew members who maybe have been doing something one way for the last 20, 30 years who are now willing to try something new. And we're super grateful for the traction that we've had and the progress that we've made, but there's so much more that needs to change in physical production, so much innovation that can happen, and we're excited to be a part of that, and I hope you guys are too. And with that, I'll say thank you.